much for coming. Everyone in this room, I'm sure, is here to a considerable extent because they really care about what is happening in China, in India, and across Asia. And we have a terrific panel of experts here to talk about exactly that today. I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Yuan Ding, Darshan Mehta, Nadir Musafizadeh, and Jing Ulrich. Thank you all for coming. Maybe I can start with you, Jing. I wanted to talk a little bit about China first. A year ago, China was doing so well. If you went to the stores in Shanghai, the luxury stores in Shanghai or Beijing, they were still full of customers. And it was a broad-based recovery. I remember going to the northeasternmost corner of China near the Siberian border north of North Korea a little over a year ago, and going into dealerships, and there were village farmers buying cars. But they were able to do so because every car had a sign on it. It was essentially $1,500 US and then 0 interest for 3 years. Now, people are more worried in China. We see the falling stock market, worries about real estate. We see concerns about consumption downgrade. What do you and your colleagues at JP Morgan see for the future looking forward, and particularly for luxury demand in China?
Well, good morning, everyone. Keith, it's a great pleasure to be here with you. And I'd like to thank Vanessa, AG, and Stephen for inviting me to speak at this great conference. Regarding the Chinese economy, we have to put things in context. This is a luxury conference. The reason why we're focusing so much on China is because China accounts for 35% of global luxury consumption. And this number will go up to 44% by 2025. So the Chinese economy this year will grow at around 6.6%. But we are seeing indeed some signs of slowing. Next year, GDP growth will probably slow to 6.1%. But the most important thing is not the actual pace or the quantity of growth, it's actually where the growth is coming from. So this year, 65% of the growth is actually coming from personal consumption. Now, investments, meaning building infrastructure, housing, and exports, we know we cannot rely on that two engines, right? Exports or investments. We have to increasingly rely on private consumption. Now this year, exports have been very strong, actually, surprisingly, despite the trade friction. And that is because a lot of the exporters are front-loading. They're exporting as much as possible before the higher tariffs kick in. Now back to consumption. Keith, you asked a question about consumption downgrades. Actually, the New York Times published an article in August saying, consumption downgrade, don't eat avocado, don't have kids, and don't have cocktails, right? So you have pockets of consumption downgrades, but you also have pockets of consumption upgrades. As always, in China, you have lots of conflicting signals sometimes, right? So what we're seeing on the ground is that because of the slowing economy, because of the trade friction, some consumers are indeed tightening their purse strings. However, if you look at the middle class, the aspirational consumers and the elites, they're still spending. And these numbers actually have just been reported by LVMH, by Kering. In the third quarter, their growth has still been very strong. Now, what we're seeing today as we speak, we just concluded the first 24 hours of the Singles Day in China, right? So again, Alibaba really had a record extravaganza. About 31 billion US dollars of sales were recorded in the first 24 hours, up from 25 billion US dollars last year. So in the first 24 hours, Alibaba delivered 1.2 billion packages. It's just incredible, almost one package per person in China, So these are the signs that consumption is still robust. Although consumers are becoming much more choosy in terms of what they buy, and they're very price conscious, of course. But I would say, if you look at the aspirational elites and middle class consumers, right, they still very much value authenticity, they value heritage, they value the quality of luxury products. That has not changed. What has changed is some rather increasing volatility in the stock market. Car sales are down for 5 straight months now. That is because a lot of the consumers in China are thinking about whether they should buy a car because of the shared economy. In the future, people will just get a Didi or Uber rather than buying a car, because a car may not be the best investment. 95% of the time, the car is parked rather than being driven, right? So there are some structural changes underway that are affecting car sales. In terms of property, you just mentioned, Keith, of course, we had a fantastic 2017 in terms of property prices, but the Chinese leadership is really trying to contain the rapid increases in housing prices because it becomes a social issue. But overall, I think consumption will continue to remain robust. Perhaps a growth rate will come off the boil in 2019, but I don't think there will be a collapse.
Thank you very much. That's a glass at least half full view, I guess, on what's going on right now in the Chinese economy. Why don't we turn, if we can, then to the Indian economy? Darshan, I've been going for 15 years to Mumbai, and we've seen a lot of hope at times. We've seen sad moments. I was there, for example, during the attack on the hotels in Mumbai, and I went to an apartment building across the street and stayed behind the water tank as they shot it out hour after hour, live blogging for our website. The water tank is because the water is one of the best barriers for stopping gunfire in these situations. But on the flip side, I've also seen just tremendous growth in, for example, the factories around Pune. So the industrial bases there. Now, as China, after years of talking about it, has finally enacted a general sales tax to replace its Byzantine system before of taxation, is that finally going to prompt luxury buyers in India to shop in India, in Mumbai, instead of going so much to London or Dubai or elsewhere?
Well, I don't think it's one's going to substitute the other. So just to take off your the last point, I think Indians, like most of the travelers from emerging markets, are going to constantly, travel outside to live their, aspiration, and shopping is going to be high on that agenda. I think domestic consumption of luxury across categories, and fashion is one of those categories, but you got fine jewelry, you got alcohol, you got, of course, automobiles. Each of those categories is seeing increasing shifts towards domestic consumption. And of course, as you mentioned, post the GST, which has been a big paradigm shift because it's made the whole country not just into a single country, but possibly cheaper than most of the European countries in terms of the overall taxation system, because you got a lower VAT equivalent, goods and services tax, and of course a credit for all what we call the input taxes. Long story short, I think for luxury brands, if you provide access, if you provide pricing which is comparable, because this is first generation money and they always compare prices, it's smart money, it's not inherited money, and of course you provide convenience and service, increasingly you'll find doorstep consumption in your own backyard rather than consumption abroad. Although, as I mentioned, because of the outbound tourism, that's going to continue, and we are seeing lots of strong signs of that in the last 15 months. In fact, you are possibly staring at between 35 and 40 million consumers, still just 3% of the population, but in absolute terms, a very large percentage of here and now ready luxury buyers, and possibly twice as much, between 75 and 80 million consumers, as what we call sporadic luxury buyers knocking on the doors of luxury. So you got large swaths of population, in a sense, coming back to it. And of course, we are a decade away from those ghastly events, so we've come a long way since then.
It's been wonderful to see the change there. Dr. Yuan,
Yeah.
I'm very interested in how you think that China's steady tightening of capital controls on moving money out of the country are going to affect luxury demand for everything from real estate to Chanel or Gucci or other luxury products. I remember 2 years ago, I went around Australia and did a story looking at demand then, and 85% of newly built apartments in the central business district of Melbourne were being purchased by Chinese investors. Now that investment has really faded because it's so hard to take large sums out of the country. How far down the chain from $1 million apartments or $10 million apartments into luxury products are you going to see an effect from the capital controls on luxury demand?
Yeah, so if we go back to that story of the capital control, we saw two waves since the late 2016. The first wave was related to the sudden drop of the foreign reserve, so you saw that. And since last year, during the first semester of last year, we had another wave of capital control, which was more related to the concern about the high leverage of Chinese acquirers. So we saw that. On the personal side, clearly there was a tightening on the money conversion into US dollars, because officially, as you know, in China, each person has a right to get 50,000 US dollars per year. And sometimes people just pool the money, friends and the parents together in order to send out and to buy some property. Clearly, as you said, there is a huge impact on the property market overseas for Chinese buyers. However, on the consumption, tourism, travel, or even purchase of luxury goods side, nothing, I feel, is impacted because of the restriction on the credit card consumption is not limited so far. So that means Chinese are still traveling freely. They can still go to Galeries Lafayette, buy whatever they want. My personal view is that this capital control is kind of temporary. And some of my colleagues, economists in CIBS, they are doing some research. And we see clearly, like Jing already mentioned, China, we are still sitting on a very nice hedging situation, which means the Chinese manufacturing companies, thanks to a lot of companies like Ruyi, and they are very competitive in the goods and in the overseas market, which means that any lower value of Chinese currency will help them to gain the competitiveness, which means that the RMB won't fall like what we saw in Turkey or other countries because of this hedging. So which means that in the long run, we will see more and more free up possibilities in the capital control. And now you see RMB is regaining among the other emerging market currencies in the international payment. So on this side, I'm quite optimistic. And of course, I want to echo what Jim mentioned about the consumption in China. The size of the market, the depth of the market gives us a lot of hope, because we are certainly sitting on something extremely unusual in the history of the human being. Because if you look at the economists from Great Britain, they published article this year, and the forecasting, and now we see the reality that in 2018, this year, the Chinese consumption market will overpass the US one with 5.7 trillion US dollars. And this actually happened first time in the history since 100 years almost, because US was the biggest market for almost 100 years. And then, you make any projection, even with the most pessimist one, you will see a Chinese market two times bigger than the US market, let's say in 10 years. So which means that this is really the place to go and to play with. And I was talking with Mikhail sitting there during the break, and we believe that the big shift for the luxurious product is really on the concept and the influence. Because if we look at the past 100 years, all the heritage came from more or less Europe. And because the market itself was US, Europe, and then later Japanese-centered, we got a lot of inspiration from Japan, but it's kind of side influence. But now, if we have 1 billion middle class, upper class Chinese, plus some Indians and Southeast Asians, then they were overwhelmingly more important than the European and American consumers, maybe 1 to 10 outnumber. So in that situation, how we adapt our design, our influence, how we absorb and integrate the cultural influence from Asia or from China or India. This is something I think very important. It's a risk, it's a threat, but it's also opportunity.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to Nadir next, but I want all of you to start thinking about your questions. Don't worry and don't wait until I ask you for your questions. Start thinking about them now, okay? With that, I wanted to ask you a question about supply chains. Your specialty is geopolitics. We've seen a very tense relationship between the United States and China this year in particular. In some industries, there have been hints of companies wanting to move their supply chains, or at least the major transformation that determines country of origin of a good, out of China. Do you see that happening in luxury goods, or really aspirational goods, because the true luxury goods, the final transformation tends to take place in Europe, but do you see that happening in consumer goods, or only in maybe sort of higher tech, more sensitive goods, aerospace and so forth? Please.
Sure. Thank you, Keith. I mean, look, we're meeting at a moment of truth in the overall economic relationship between China and the United States and China and the West. We're sitting here right between the US midterms and the President Trump's meeting with President Xi in Buenos Aires later this month. And I think what will answer that question is really what will this future form of the US-China economic relationship take. I think if you look back at the last 2 years, it has been, certainly for Beijing, in many ways a bewildering period. Trying to understand what is the form of economic and security relationship that the United States wants with China, and how can they negotiate their way to it. And I think they've been faced with two fundamental challenges, one in a way more serious than the other, and certainly more long-term. The first was how to deal with this new president who came into office with a fundamental view that China had had too good a deal for too long with the United States, and how would the redress take form. And I think you've seen in all the debates coming out of Washington between the various kinds of economic policymakers and trade policymakers, this increased push on China, trying to make sure that it becomes a different balance and a different relationship going forward. I think what Beijing has found more surprising, and why we're still at a point today where there is no visibility really on what the final deal will look like, if there is going to be a deal, is that the big picture that China missed was that alongside this populist politician who came to power thinking about all the ways in which Chinese manufacturing and Chinese trade and IP policies had, in his view and the view of many, had too good a deal with the United States, there is a broader underlying sense across political divide in the United States. And you can have this conversation on the Hill, you can have it everywhere in Washington, and in the corporate world as well, that this is a moment to reset the economic relationship with the United States. And I think that has been the much bigger surprise for China. So when you look at the way in which China has had to try to plan for this next phase of the relationship, I think fundamentally the assumption still is that what the United States is looking for, and what Donald Trump in particular is looking for, is simply a better margin in the business of the United States with China. If you think about it, basically the kind of margin compression that Donald Trump is looking for, is thinking basically China has had a very good business for a very long time in the United States, maybe running at a 50 or 60% margin, pick your number. This margin now needs to come down. It needs to come down to 30%, 20%, again, pick your number. The important part here is that Donald Trump is still looking for a good deal, is still looking for a future of an economic integration with China. And I think the real challenge for China is not can we get a deal with Donald Trump, but their recognition increasingly that Trump may be the last US president who will do a kind of deal that they're looking for, because underlying is a much bigger shift in the view of the United States in its economic relationship with China. If you look at the supply chain shift that has happened already, you're seeing certainly in consumer electronics, Chinese manufacturers and Chinese companies, first of all, now meeting a pretty blanket no to selling a lot of their products directly from China to the United States, and moving some of their manufacturing to Brazil, to Mexico, and other places from which to sell into the United States. I think that will continue in those sectors. Whether it moves into other sectors, I think still is a question of where the economic and trade relationship lands. And I think we still don't know the answer to that. I think we're going to get to one answer by the end of this year. The Chinese clearly were waiting for the midterms. Donald Trump was waiting for the midterms. I think we're going to see the shape of the US economy. What are the signs of a hiking rate environment, and what will that do to inflation? What will that do to the overall strength of the US economy? But while the form, I think, of this economic future relationship is still unclear, what every business, I think, has to get used to is that there is still a strong and fundamental view in US business that a future economic relationship with China is essential, is existential, but it will be on different terms. We are not going towards an economic Cold War. I genuinely don't believe that. But we're going to go to a new equilibrium at a different price point, at a different margin between the United States and China. And that is one where, frankly, a lot of the supply chain shift that was happening anyway for competitiveness reasons will continue, and that the marginal shifts will happen more as a function of where this trade relationship gets negotiated.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Why don't I take it back to you then, Jing, and after Jing, we're going to turn to you. So think about your questions one more time. But first, I guess a lot of people are wondering what the future holds for the renminbi, for China's currency. Now, we had Dr. Yuan say that China's currency is not going to fall the way Turkey's or some other countries have recently. Even in a rising interest rate environment for emerging markets, China does have a lot of reserves. And certainly China has strengths as an exporter, for example, as Ruyi talked about, going from 120 employees to 10 employees to produce the same quantity of fabric. On the other hand, Jing, you were talking about how there's been a lot of front loading of exports, which makes people wonder if the trade surplus will shrink next year. If the RMB weakens below 7, will it be a smooth process? Even if it's only 1%, which doesn't make a big difference in anybody's bottom line, will that trigger a psychological response in terms of damaging confidence in Chinese financial markets, damaging confidence in real estate markets, damaging confidence perhaps in luxury spending? What is your take on it?
Well, the currency in China is absolutely critical to the consumption story we've been speaking about. This morning at 9:30 a.m., the central bank set the RMB exchange rate at 6.95, which means we're only 5 basis points away from 7. So does it make a big difference, 5 basis points? I would argue not. The only difference is psychological. So in the luxury industry, we know Chinese people have been the biggest buyer of luxury goods around the world, not just in China, but globally. This year, around 150 million Chinese people will be traveling overseas. And the Chinese consumers are the most astute currency arbitrage consumers, right? So they will go where they can buy the best products at the cheapest price. So just look at where the Chinese travelers are going. So when the Turkish lira fell very sharply a few months ago, a lot of the Chinese travelers suddenly went to Turkey to buy luxury goods because the brands had not had a chance to adjust their prices in local currency terms. And also, if you think about where Chinese people are traveling, of course, earlier on we talked about the US-China trade tension. Indeed, according to Skyscanner, in the October Golden Holiday period, Chinese tourist bookings to the United States went down by some 42%. That basically is a reflection of the friction between the two countries. We hope this is temporary because Chinese people are the single biggest spending group out of any national group to the United States. Each person, each Chinese person traveling to America spends about $7,000 US. That's quite a lot of money. Other nations, other people from different parts of the world, on average spend about $4,400 US. So China remains the largest spender in America. Of course, they're going farther afield. They go to Europe, they go to France, they go to Italy, they go to Australia increasingly. We have Qantas Airlines, Alan Joyce in the audience as well. But if you look at where Chinese people are traveling, they will go where the currencies are most advantageous for their purchases. So if the Chinese RMB weakens further, that may temporarily dampen their spending abroad. So for example, Hong Kong is pegged to the US dollar. So in the last year, the Chinese yuan depreciated about 7% against the US dollar. That means the Chinese yuan depreciated about 7% against Hong Kong dollar, right? So maybe the Chinese people will think twice about coming to Hong Kong. They may choose to go to other places where the currency is weaker. Still, Hong Kong attracts 45 million Chinese travelers every year. Of course, a lot of them are day trippers from Shenzhen into Hong Kong. But look at the rest of Asia. Thailand is a popular destination, 12 million Chinese travelers every year. Also, Japan, don't forget about Japan, because now we're seeing a warming relations between China and Japan after the Prime Minister Abe visited Beijing recently, Korea as well. So I think Chinese people will look at their currency, the Chinese yuan, versus other currencies to determine where they can have the best experience, the best shopping experience, and to buy the best products at the lowest prices. Back to the macro picture, I think the Chinese leadership will do everything possible to keep the RMB stable. Because as we know, if the currency weakens too much, that would really put a damper on sentiment. At this point, given the volatility in the stock market, given the unpredictability of US-China trade relations, I think the Chinese leadership is doing everything possible that they can control basically everything domestic. So look what they have done. They have now introduced tax cuts to Chinese consumers and small and medium-sized enterprises. Just over the weekend, the Chinese leadership came out to say 50% of new lending of Chinese banks will go to private enterprises. This is quite important for the luxury industry. Remember, a lot of the owners of private companies are actually your consumers, right? They're among the elites. They have a lot of higher income. They own businesses. In the recent months, their sentiment has been weakened because of the difficulty in accessing financing. So the Chinese leadership is looking at the economy in a holistic way, from monetary policy, fiscal policy in terms of tax cuts and boosting spending, and also the currency. They want to keep things on an even keel in China, especially as we go into the new year where you have a host of uncertainties on the global front.
Those are the strong arguments we're hearing from JP Morgan and others on why the currency may not, as you were also saying, fall precipitously the way some other emerging markets have seen lately. With that, I'd like to open the floor to your questions. Who would like to go first? Okay, I'm going to give you another 2 minutes to think about it. I'm going to ask a quick question to Darshan here, unless, oh wait, we have somebody. Here we go.
Good morning, I'm Michele Nolsa. I have a question for Mr. Mehta. We know China and India are extremely different from government, religion, traditions, age groups, and we have seen a development of a luxury industry in India being very, very slow. But besides things which are difficult to realize, infrastructure, investment, long-term obstacle, why India is still one of the few countries, together with Brazil and Russia, to keep very high duties for import of luxury goods? 10 years ago, we were talking about the BRICS. Now, it has remained only China in terms of size of the luxury market. All the others, they remain good customers around the world, but very weak domestic markets.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Nolsa. And I was hoping someone does ask this question, because if you actually do the math, post the goods and services tax coming into play, which was 1st July last year, India has possibly become cheaper than most of the European markets to do business. A simple math, on luxury clothing, India's VAT now is 12% against 20 to 22% across Europe. So you have a 10% arbitrage point on the retail selling price. On the importation, you only now have a 20% customs duty on the import price. If you do the math, it's still 2 to 3% cheaper in India than most of the European markets. All other taxes paid in between are subsumed or credited against the final VAT or the final GST price. So starting from 1st July last year, actually most of the luxury brands should be resetting their prices in India to be virtually on par, actually mathematically even slightly cheaper. So in going back to that answer, and Jing made that point about Chinese consumers, likewise Indian consumers and most emerging market consumers, the first generation money as we call them, are very sharp in doing price comparisons. And those of the brands who have actually done the price reset and the price arbitrage are already, so to say, finding the results of increased domestic consumption. Actually, the Indian challenge is less on taxes, or in fact doesn't exist on taxes, is more on the brick and mortar infrastructure. And given the fact that you now have the world's largest mobile data consumption country in the world, and the fact that you have the second largest smartphone market in the world. So about 460 million internet consumers, 95% consume that internet on your mobile phones, and 150 million actually transact online. Given that math, we'd like to believe at Reliance that there is going to be a dramatic shift, the so-called inflection point that a lot of us have been waiting for a long period of time to happen actually in India on consumption across the pyramid. Of course, at the base level of the consumption, we are now the 4th largest retail market in the world. But actually, as we go more towards the tip of that inflection point is going to happen, because unlike China, we've not had the infrastructural advantage, given of course the different political systems, and that's been holding the market back. So I think it's more a supply-starved market rather than a demand-starved market. More often than not, in India, supply creates a demand, so it's a market pregnant with demand. And I think the GST, coupled with the digital economy coming very fast into play, is going to bring that into force.
Okay, thank you. Who's next? Okay, with that, maybe oh, here we've got one back here on the right-hand side.
Hello there, Simon Williamson from Value Retail. I just had a question for the panel, and it was particularly about the recent expo, Import Expo in Shanghai that took place last week, which I've heard very little reference to and also not seen that much press about specifically. And I was wondering what the panel's view was on the statements that were made during the expo and the impact the expo will have on the import market to China specifically for luxury.
I was in the room when President Xi made those remarks, and we did have a long story in the New York Times about them. It was interesting that one of the reasons why you might not have seen more media coverage since you mentioned that is that he didn't make a big change in Chinese policy. They seem to be saving real trade concessions potentially, and I want to get Jing's view on this next, but they seemed to be saving real concessions for the negotiations with the Americans coming up on December 1. But actually, first, why don't I ask you? I just spoke with Jim.
Okay. So I think there's one thing everybody missed in Xi Jinping's speech, which for me is extremely important, is that for the first time he mentioned the opening of healthcare and the education market to the foreign investment. This never happened in the previous speeches because we always heard about the finance, insurance, automotive, but this is the first time he made such a commitment. From my own point of view, this import fair is extremely important for the branding and the propaganda purpose, especially now it makes the Chinese feel politically correct to absorb importations from overseas, which will help Chinese companies and organizations to set up more infrastructures to take products out of China, and which will help the booming of the consumption market, and which also send a very strong signal to the overseas that China now is becoming a consumption place instead of investment or infrastructure place. That's very important.
That is an excellent point, because on healthcare and on education, it was happening, but without sort of this clear imprimatur. It's true. Jing.
Yeah, so value retail, of course, has had a lot of success in China, with your outlet malls in Suzhou and Shanghai. Of course, like you and other executives around the room are looking at China's appetite for luxury products, right? So during the import fair, I was there in Shanghai speaking at various events. A few things to note. President Xi said in his speech, in the next 15 years, China will be importing $30 trillion of goods, plus $10 trillion of services. The $30 trillion number has been repeated quite frequently, but a lot of people have missed that $10 trillion of services, right? So last year, China imported 1.8 trillion. That's only 12% of GDP. So I think increasingly, as the Chinese economy will be driven by consumption, imports of goods and services will actually rise. And this is one of the reasons why President Xi emphasized these numbers. So combined, in the next 15 years, China will be importing $40 trillion of goods and services. What is also interesting is that during the trade fair, you had 18 countries, heads of state, a lot of them from the Belt and Road countries, coming to join. You had 130 countries participants. It was a really impressive showing, and thousands and thousands of companies displaying their products and services, right? But what also was very interesting is that this interesting analogy President Xi made during his keynote speech. He said China is an ocean. China is not a small pond. If you're an ocean, there are some calm days and there are some stormy days. So we're expecting some stormy days ahead, but that doesn't mean we will not survive. He said China has been here for 5,000 years. We'll still be here for the next 5,000 years, which is really quite interesting if you look at his poetic rendering or analogy between China and an ocean. Basically, he is really trying to impart a sense of confidence and a sense of preparedness in view of potentially stormy days ahead.
It was very striking, and for those of you who haven't been to the Shanghai Expo Hall, what a spectacular place. 5 times the size of the Javits Center back in New York City. So when you see the infrastructure that China manages to build, it's hard not to see how it still has a lot of potential ahead. With that, we need to wrap up. I just want to summarize. I thought each of our panelists made a particularly interesting point. Jing, for starters, mentioning that the car sales, which to some look almost scary, down over 10% year on year the last couple of months. That may be because of a shift towards a sharing economy. It might not be an indicator that the broader economy is having difficulty. India, very hopeful remarks on how, with the imposition finally of the general sales tax replacing such a complicated tax system, there are opportunities maybe to sell at more reasonable prices, particularly when you consider that the tax rates on domestic sales in India are actually lower than the VATs, half of what you see on VATs in Europe, even though India does have fairly high import duties. Dr. Yuan here spoke about how the RMB is more durable, and that's something I think everybody here in Hong Kong and everybody in China is watching very closely, but China does have a lot of resources to defend the RMB. And then finally, Nadir had the very good point that he's not expecting an economic Cold War. We had a very strong speech from former Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson in Singapore last week, in which he warned of whether an economic iron curtain is falling between the United States and China. But not everybody believes it. There are signs. China is the ocean, as President Xi put it. And it will be here for a long time, and it's been here a long time already. With that, I'd like to let you know of a couple of things. First of all, if you have any changes to your dinner plans, please let registration know by the time of the coffee break. Second of all, if you haven't yet signed up for a lunch panel, I hope all of you have seen in your programs, we have different tables at lunch, different people talking about different issues with the people at their tables. Please look and figure out where you want to be eating. And then finally, I'd like to make sure that, I'm sorry, Jing,
I just have one word. Once you finish, I want to say a word about Chairman Chiu's excellent presentation just now. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you. And then finally, I wanted to say that all of you, please do come back at noon sharp from your refreshment break. I know you're going to have a chance to meet, great chance to meet some of the other people, some of the other leaders of the industry here, but we have more great panels coming up at noon, so please come back promptly. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
So Keith, I want to say a word because Chairman Chiu is obviously an icon in our industry, and Vanessa and Chairman Chiu had a great discussion just now. But everyone must know Chairman Chiu is from Shandong province. Shandong province is where Confucius is from. So Chairman Chiu is always delighted to show everyone Confucius' hometown. On the way over here, I was reading a comment by Confucius made thousands of years ago. He said, "A green reed that bends in the wind is stronger than the mighty oak that breaks in a storm." So that makes me think that China is a green reed. The economy may be bending, but not breaking. So I want to link the two panels.
Thank you very much. Very well said.